The shot that shattered the morning calm of Redemption Creek was not the first Jack Coulter had heard that day, but it was the one that mattered. It was close, sharp, and followed by the sound of splintering wood and panicked screams that cut through the thick, drowsy heat. Jack, sitting on the porch of his small homestead on the edge of town, didn't move. He had spent 5 years learning not to move, learning to let the world's clamor pass him by like a river flowing around a stone. He'd had his fill of shattered calms. His right hand resting on his knee was a map of old scars, a testament to a life spent imposing order on chaos. Now it was just a hand that ached when the weather turned. Another shot, then a volley. The screams grew louder, closer. Dust billowed from the end of the main street, a rising ochre cloud against a mercilessly blue sky. A horse whinnied in terror. Jack closed his eyes, the sounds painting a picture he knew too well. The metallic tang of fear, the sudden desperate scramble for cover, the cold efficiency of men who dealt in violence. He had retired from that world. He had buried his badge with Eleanor. He took a slow sip of the lukewarm coffee in his tin cup. The town of Redemption Creek had offered him anonymity, a place to let his grief scab over into a quiet, permanent scar. The townsfolk knew he was a former lawman, but they respected his privacy, leaving him to the company of his ghosts. He was a relic, a man out of time, and he preferred it that way. But the chaos refused to be ignored. A woman's shriek, high and thin, pierced through the noise. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that bypassed the walls he had built around his heart and struck a nerve he thought long dead. Against his will, against every resolution he had made at Eleanor's graveside, Jack stood up. His joints protested, and he moved with the stiff grace of a man who had forgotten how to be anything but weary. He set his cup down on the porch railing and walked to the edge of his property, his gaze fixed on the unfolding drama down the street. The first bank of Redemption Creek was under siege. 4 masked men clad in dusters that did little to hide the rifles in their hands were backing out of the entrance, using a handful of townsfolk as human shields. They moved with a practiced, brutal economy. Jack's eyes still sharp despite the haze of memory took in the details. They were professionals, organized. Their leader stood apart, a tall, commanding figure who moved with an unnerving stillness. Even from a distance, Jack could sense an aura of cold intelligence that was more dangerous than any loaded gun. The man wasn't wearing a mask. His face was pale-framed by dark hair, and he wore a tailored black coat that seemed out of place in the gritty, sun-baked street. He surveyed the scene not with the frantic energy of a common thief, but with the detached air of a conductor overseeing his orchestra. One of the hostages, a young woman who worked as a clerk at the general store, stumbled. In her panic, she jostled the leader. He didn't strike her. Instead, with a motion as swift and predatory as a striking snake, he reached out and tore something from her neck. It glinted in the sunlight, a flash of polished silver. The woman cried out a sound of loss more than pain. Jack's breath hitched. His heart, a sluggish and dormant thing for half a decade, gave a painful lurch. It was a locket. A silver heart-shaped locket, identical to the one he had given Eleanor on their first anniversary. He had commissioned it himself from a silversmith in St. Louis, with an intricate filigree of vines etched around the edges. There couldn't be another one like it. Not exactly. The leader, Silas Blackwood, as Jack would later learn his name, was held the locket up to the light, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He examined it for a moment, then pocketed it with a casual finality that felt like a desecration. He barked an order, and his men began to herd the hostages toward their horses. The world around Jack seemed to shrink, the sounds of the robbery fading into a dull roar. All he could see was that flash of silver, a ghost of a memory made brutally real. That locket was meant to lie with Eleanor, a symbol of a love that death had interrupted but not ended. Seeing it now stolen and held in the hand of a killer was like watching her grave be defiled. The stone in the river, worn smooth by years of grief, finally shifted. A current of cold, familiar rage, an emotion he thought he had buried forever, began to flow through him. He turned and walked back into his house. His movements no longer stiff or weary, but filled with a terrible, long-forgotten purpose. He went to the old sea chest at the foot of his bed, the one he hadn't opened in 5 years. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket, lay his gun belt. The leather was supple, cared for out of old habit. The Colt Peacemaker rested in its holster, its steel cool and heavy in his hand. It felt like an extension of his own arm, a part of himself he had tried to amputate. He strapped the belt around his waist. The weight was familiar, comforting, and damning. The past was never truly buried. It just waited for the right shovel to dig it up. Jack Coulter had once been a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear across 3 territories. As a U.S. Marshal, he had been relentless, a man who believed the law was an absolute, a clean, hard line drawn in the dust between right and wrong. He had hunted down men others deemed untouchable, dismantling gangs and bringing a fragile order to the frontier's most lawless corners. But his certainty had been a brittle thing. It had shattered the day a stray bullet meant for him during a raid on a moonshiner's den had struck Eleanor instead. She had died in his arms, her last breath a soft sigh against his cheek. And the law he had served so faithfully had offered no justice, only paperwork. He resigned his commission the next day. The world, once a clear map of moral absolutes, had become a gray, meaningless landscape. He had drifted aimless and hollowed out until he found Redemption Creek, a town whose name felt like a bitter joke. Here, he bought a small plot of land and settled into a life of quiet penance, tending a small garden and a few chickens, his only company, the ghost of a woman, with a laugh like wind chimes. The town itself was a microcosm of the West, a collection of hopeful prospectors, weary ranchers and merchants trying to build something permanent on the edge of nowhere. But a shadow had fallen over it in the last year, a shadow named Silas Blackwood. He and his gang had appeared as if from nowhere, their influence spreading like a fever. They didn't just rob and kill. They choked the life out of the region with a more insidious kind of violence. They bought up water rights, foreclosed on struggling ranches, and intimidated anyone who stood in their way. Redemption Creek was a town living on borrowed time, its spirit slowly being bleached away by the relentless sun of Blackwood's ambition. The local sheriff, a man named Miller, was a decent man, but he was outmatched, and everyone knew it. His 2 deputies were young and green, no match for Blackwood's seasoned killers. The law in Redemption Creek was a suggestion, not a command. Jack had watched it all from his self-imposed exile, telling himself it wasn't his fight. He had paid his dues. He had sacrificed everything for the law, and it had taken everything in return. He wanted no part of it anymore. The world could burn for all he cared. He had already lost his. Until the locket. That small piece of silver had changed the equation. It had transformed Blackwood from a distant threat into a personal affront. It had made the fight his. 2 days after the robbery, Sheriff Miller rode out to Jack's homestead. He was a man in his late 50s, with a drooping mustache and eyes that held the permanent exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle. He dismounted, his movements slow, and tied his horse to the porch rail. "Coulter," he said, nodding a greeting. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Sheriff Jack replied, his voice raspy from disuse. He sat on his porch step, cleaning the Colt, the motions so ingrained they were second nature. "You heard about the bank?" Miller asked, though it wasn't a real question. "Heard it, saw some of it." Miller sighed, running a hand over his face. They took near $10,000, killed old man Hemlock when he tried to be a hero, and they took hostages. Let him go a few miles out, but not before scaring them half to death. He paused, his eyes landing on the gun in Jack's hands. I need help, Coulter. I can't handle Blackwood on my own. My deputies are good boys, but they're not ready for this. The town's terrified. People are talking about packing up and leaving. Jack continued to methodically clean his revolver, not looking up. My fighting days are over, Miller. You know that. Are they? The sheriff pressed, his voice edged with desperation. I saw you watching from your porch. Saw the look on your face. This ain't just another town for you anymore, is it? Blackwood made it personal. Jack stopped his work, his knuckles white around the gun's handle. He had refused this request a dozen times over the past year. He had recited the same lines, offered the same cold refusal. But this time, the words felt hollow. The image of the locket glinting in Blackwood's hand was seared into his mind. He still said nothing. I ain't asking you to pin on a badge, Miller said, sensing the shift. Just help me look into him. You know how to track men like this. You know how they think. Anything you find could help. For a long moment, the only sound was the buzz of cicadas in the dry afternoon air. Jack thought of Eleanor, of the promise he had made to her, a silent vow to leave violence behind. But he also thought of that locket, a sacred object now in the possession of a man who represented everything he had once fought against. What was the greater betrayal, breaking his vow to Eleanor, or allowing her memory to be so crudely dishonored? He slowly, deliberately reassembled the Colt, the clicks of the cylinder seating into place, sounding like the final tumblers of a lock falling open. I'm not a lawman anymore, he said, his voice a low gravel. I won't be taking orders. A wave of relief washed over Miller's face. Understood. Anything you need, you ask? I'll need to know everything you've got on Blackwood. Not much, Miller admitted. He and his men rode in about a year back. Set up at the old Bar B ranch north of town. They pay for their supplies in cash, mostly gold coin. No one knows where he comes from. He's like a ghost. A ghost? Jack knew all about ghosts. He slid the Colt back into its holster. He had told Miller no, but the locket had already said yes. His investigation wouldn't be for the town, or for the law, or for Sheriff Miller. It would be for Eleanor. A final bloody piece of business. He would get her locket back. And he would find out why a man like Silas Blackwood would be carrying a perfect copy of it in the first place. That question, more than anything else, was the one that demanded an answer. Jack's investigation began not with a trail of hoof prints, but with a whisper in the dark. He knew that men like Blackwood didn't operate in a vacuum. They needed supplies information and the complicity of frightened or greedy people. He started at the saloon, the heart of Redemption Creek's nervous system. He sat at a corner table, a glass of rye untouched before him, and simply listened. The low murmur of prospectors, the sharp smell of cheap whiskey, and a haze of cigar smoke, catching the golden afternoon light slanting through the grimy windows. It was a world he knew intimately. He listened to the hushed conversations, the fragments of gossip, the fear that hung in the air, thicker than the smoke. He heard about ranchers being pressured to sell their wells mysteriously running dry. He heard about a surveyor from out east who had asked too many questions about land deeds and then disappeared a month ago. And he heard the name of a man, a low-level thug named Cletus, who was known to brag when he was deep in his cups about his connections to Blackwood's outfit. That evening, Jack found Cletus stumbling out of the saloon, reeking of whiskey and self-importance. Jack followed him into the alley. The confrontation was brief and one-sided. Cletus, emboldened by drink, reached for his sidearm. Jack moved with a speed that belied his years, his hand a blur as he disarmed the man, and slammed him against the rough brick wall. "I hear you work for Blackwood Jack," said his voice flat and cold. Cletus's drunken bravado evaporated, replaced by a raw animal fear. "I don't know nothing," he stammered. Jack pressed the barrel of his Colt under the man's chin. "You're going to know something in about 5 seconds." Cletus talked. He told Jack about a supply camp hidden in the canyons a few miles east of town, a place where Blackwood's men gathered before and after jobs. He babbled about shipments of dynamite and new rifles arriving by night. The next day before dawn, Jack rode out. The air was cool and smelled of sagebrush and the gritty taste of red dust. He found the camp exactly where Cletus had described it, tucked into a box canyon that offered a clear line of sight on the only approach. It was a smart defensive position, too smart for common outlaws. He left his horse tied in a ravine and approached on foot, moving with the silence of a predator. 2 men were on guard, lazy and confident in their seclusion. Jack dealt with them quickly and quietly, using the butt of his pistol rather than a bullet. He wasn't here to kill, not yet. He was here to learn. The camp was larger than he'd expected. It was more than a hideout. It was a staging ground for a small army. There were crates of repeating rifles still packed in grease and enough ammunition to lay siege to a fort. Blackwood wasn't just a gang leader. He was a general planning a war. In the main tent, which was clearly Blackwood's, Jack found what he was looking for, a clue. On a small makeshift desk lay a stack of papers, land deeds, water rights claims, geological survey maps. Blackwood wasn't just terrorizing the county. He was systematically acquiring it. But tucked beneath the maps was something else. A small leather-bound book of poetry. It seemed strangely out of place amidst the tools of violence. Jack picked it up. A slip of paper marked a page. It was a train ticket stub dated 3 years prior for a journey from a small town in the Northern Territories named Silver Falls. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Silver Falls. The town where he had served his last post as marshal. The town where Eleanor had died. The connection was too specific to be a coincidence. The locket, and now this. His past was no longer a ghost haunting his memories. It was an active force reaching across the years to find him in Redemption Creek. He pocketed the ticket stub just as he heard the sound of approaching riders. It was a large party moving fast. He slipped out of the tent and faded back into the rocks, the sun now rising and casting long shadows across the canyon floor. He had what he came for. The fight with Silas Blackwood was no longer just about a stolen locket. It was about a shared history, a history Jack now had to unearth before it buried him. Returning to Redemption Creek, Jack knew he could no longer work alone. Blackwood's operation was too large, too well organized, and the connection to Silver Falls made the stakes dangerously personal. He needed allies, people with skills he didn't possess, and a reason to fight as fiercely as he would. His first stop was the office of Dr. Alistair Finch. The doctor was a man of science and cynicism, an Englishman who had come west seeking adventure and found only ignorance and dust. He was educated, precise, and possessed a sharp mind that saw through the town's facade of weary resignation. Jack found him stitching up a ranch hand who had gotten the worst of a saloon brawl. Coulter Finch said, not looking up from his work, his voice clipped and precise. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit? A sudden ailment? Or is this about the cancer that calls itself Silas Blackwood?" "The latter," Jack said. "I need information. You hear things. You patch up men from his crew." Finch tied off a suture with a neat, practiced motion. "I do. And I see the results of his business. Broken bones, gunshot wounds, families bankrupted when he cuts off their water. He is a disease, and this town is dying from it. He finally looked at Jack, his blue eyes sharp and analytical. "I've wondered when you would finally tire of your gardening." Jack ignored the barb. "I found evidence he's buying up the whole valley. But I think it's about more than land." Finch cleaned his instruments. "Of course it is. Greed is rarely so simple. Blackwood moves with the conviction of a zealot, not a businessman. There's a fire in him, a purpose that goes beyond money." He gestured for the ranch hand to leave. "I'll help you, Coulter. Not because I believe in your brand of frontier justice, but because I believe in lancing a boil before it poisons the entire body. What do you need?" "Ears," Jack said, "and a safe place to meet. Your discretion is valued." His second ally was younger, a ranch hand named Elias Vance. Elias's family had owned a spread in the valley for 2 generations until Blackwood had dammed the creek that fed their land, forcing them to sell for pennies on the dollar. The Vances had been broken by it, but the injustice had forged a core of hard steel in the young man. Jack found him working at the livery stable, his movements filled with a quiet, simmering anger. "They say you're going after Blackwood." Elias said, his voice low. News traveled fast in a town starved for hope. "I'm looking into him," Jack corrected. "My family lost everything because of him," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. He laughed while my father begged him for more time. "I know this land better than anyone. I know the trails his men use, the watering holes they frequent. I can track, I can shoot, and I hate him enough to be useful. Put me to work." With Finch as his source of intelligence and Elias as his eyes and ears in the wild, Jack's investigation gained momentum. They met in the back room of Finch's surgery, the sharp scent of carbolic acid, a strange backdrop for their clandestine councils of war. Elias confirmed that Blackwood's men moved with unnatural confidence, as if they knew the sheriff's patrols in advance. Finch, through conversations with a wounded gang member, learned that Sheriff Miller was a frequent visitor to Blackwood's ranch, always arriving after dark. The conclusion was unavoidable: the town's top lawman was on the payroll. The knowledge was a bitter pill for Jack. He had always despised corrupt lawmen more than common outlaws. It was a betrayal of a sacred trust. It also explained why Blackwood always seemed to be one step ahead. Miller was feeding him information. This realization created a thick cloud of paranoia. They couldn't trust anyone. Every move they made, every plan they laid, had to assume the sheriff was listening. One evening, Elias returned from a reconnaissance mission, his face pale. "He knows," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was watching one of his patrols near the North Pass. Blackwood himself was with them. He stopped, looked right at the rocks where I was hiding, and smiled. He didn't send his men after me. He just watched me. It was like he was enjoying a private joke." The game had changed. Blackwood wasn't just reacting to Jack's investigation. He was toying with them. He was allowing them to uncover pieces of the puzzle guiding their search. But why the feeling of being a pawn in a much larger, more personal game settled over Jack cold and heavy. The pieces finally clicked into place in the dusty archives of the town's newspaper office. Guided by the train ticket from Silver Falls, Jack spent an afternoon poring over old editions of the Silver Falls Chronicle, sent by Stagecoach years ago as part of an exchange with the Redemption Creek Gazette. His hand stained with ink and dust trembled slightly as he scanned the pages from 5 years prior, the period surrounding Eleanor's death. And then he found it. It wasn't a headline. It was a small article on an inside page, a dry report on a local business matter. The article detailed the financial collapse and ruin of a prominent local family, the Blackwoods. Their patriarch, a wealthy mine owner named Alistair Blackwood, had been exposed for running a massive fraud scheme, salting his silver mine with ore from other regions, to inflate its value and swindle investors. The article named the U.S. Marshal, whose meticulous investigation had uncovered the fraud and brought the family's empire crashing down. The Marshal's name was Jack Coulter. Jack sat back in his chair, the dusty air in the small room, suddenly feeling thin and hard to breathe. He remembered the case vaguely, a complex web of financial deceit, a proud old man who refused to admit his mine had run dry. He had done his job, followed the evidence, and secured a conviction. Alistair Blackwood had taken his own life in his cell before sentencing. It had been a tragic but not uncommon end to such a case. He had filed his report and moved on to the next one. But the article contained details he had never known. It mentioned Alistair's family, a wife who had succumbed to illness shortly after the scandal broke, and 2 children, a son named Silas and a daughter named... He read the name, and the blood drained from his face. A daughter named Annabelle. The article included a brief, tragic postscript. Annabelle Blackwood, distraught over her family's disgrace and her father's death, had taken a walk along the river gorge outside of town and had never returned. Her body was found weeks later. The death was ruled an accident, a fall from the treacherous cliffs. Silas Blackwood, Annabelle Blackwood, Silver Falls. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. This wasn't about land or money or power. This was about revenge. Silas Blackwood had spent the last 5 years building his own twisted empire, all with a single goal: to destroy the man he held responsible for the destruction of his family. He had followed Jack, learned his history, and found him in his quiet exile in Redemption Creek. He wasn't just trying to ruin a town. He was trying to ruin Jack's world piece by piece, just as he believed Jack had ruined his. Every move, every threat, every land grab, it was all a prelude, a tightening of the noose around Jack's neck. And the locket. Dear God, the locket. It had to be hers. Annabelle's. A memento of the sister he had lost, a symbol of the vengeance he sought. Jack walked out of the newspaper office into the blinding afternoon sun. The world looked different, sharper, its colors more vibrant and menacing. He was no longer a man haunted by a random tragedy. He was a man being hunted by the direct consequences of his own past. He had drawn a clean, hard line in the dust all those years ago in Silver Falls, and now the ghost of that line had come back to claim him. Blackwood, knowing his identity and motive were now exposed, wasted no time in escalating the conflict from a cold war to a hot one. The pretense was over. The next evening, as Dr. Finch was closing his surgery, 4 of Blackwood's men kicked in his door. They didn't rob him. They simply beat him methodically and brutally, leaving him unconscious on the floor of his office. They took nothing but his ledger of patients, a clear message that Blackwood knew who Jack's allies were. Elias Vance found him an hour later. Jack arrived to a scene of quiet devastation. The surgery was wrecked, glass crunched underfoot, and Finch was lying on a cot, his face a swollen mask of bruises. Elias was tending to him, his young face a mixture of fury and fear. "He's alive," Elias said, his voice tight. "Broken rib concussion. He'll live." Finch stirred his one good eye, focusing on Jack. "Message delivered." He rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. Before Jack could respond, a boy from the livery stable ran in, breathless. "Mr. Coulter, they took him. They took Elias's paw." Blackwood had retaliated on all fronts. While his men were attacking Finch, another group had ridden to the small homestead where Elias's parents lived, taking his father hostage. The message was no longer subtle. It was an ultimatum written in violence and fear. And it came delivered by a lone rider who left a note nailed to the sheriff's office door. The handwriting was elegant, precise. "Coulter, you have taken an interest in my affairs. It is time we concluded our business. The saloon, sundown, come alone. Your presence will secure the safe return of Mr. Vance. Your refusal will have consequences for the entire town. I trust you will make the honorable choice. S. Blackwood. As Jack read the note, the sky to the west began to darken, not with the approaching dusk, but with the bruised purple of an oncoming storm. The wind picked up, kicking dust and grit into the air, a low moan whistling through the eaves of the buildings. A sandstorm. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring to create the perfect stage for their final confrontation. Sheriff Miller appeared, his face ashen. "Jack, you can't go. It's a trap." "It's not a trap," Jack said, his voice calm, the rage inside him now cooled to a hard, dense core of purpose. "It's a reckoning." He looked at Elias, whose face was a portrait of anguish. "I'll get your father back." He checked his Colt, ensuring it was fully loaded. He could feel the weight of his past, the ghosts of Silver Falls, the memory of Eleanor, all converging on this single point in time. Blackwood wanted a showdown, a dramatic final act in his play of revenge. He wanted to strip Jack of everything, just as he felt everything had been stripped from him. As Jack walked down the main street toward the saloon, the wind howled, whipping his coat around him and stinging his eyes with sand. The townsfolk, sensing the impending violence, had vanished. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Redemption Creek had become a ghost town, its only inhabitants, the two men whose shared past was about to erupt. The sky was now a churning vortex of brown and gray, the sun a pale, sickly disk. The world was shrinking, contracting, until all that existed was the dusty street and the swinging doors of the saloon at the end of it. He was walking toward his past, to a final accounting for a justice he had delivered 5 years ago, never imagining the price would come due so late and so violently. The saloon was an island of tense silence in the heart of the roaring sandstorm. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the windows and forcing sand through every crack in the building's old bones. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. Silas Blackwood sat alone at a poker table in the center of the room, a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses before him. 4 of his best men stood grimly in the corners, rifles held ready. They were trapped, all of them, in this claustrophobic theater of Blackwood's design. Jack pushed through the swinging doors, which slammed shut behind him with a violent crack. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lantern-lit interior. His gaze met Blackwood's. There was no flicker of surprise in the other man's eyes, only a kind of grim satisfaction. Marshal Coulter Blackwood said, his voice smooth and articulate, a stark contrast to the howling gale outside. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Please join me. It seems we have some time to kill before the world outside decides to calm itself." He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. Jack walked slowly to the table, his spurs ringing softly on the wooden floor. He didn't sit. He stood, his hand resting loosely near the butt of his Colt. "Let Vance go, Blackwood. Your business is with me." Blackwood smiled, a cold, mirthless expression. "All in due time. First a drink, to old debts." He poured a glass of bourbon and slid it across the table. Jack ignored it. "You believe I owe you a debt," Jack stated, his voice flat. A debt. Blackwood's laugh was a dry, rustling sound. "No, Marshal. What you owe me cannot be repaid. It can only be balanced. You took my family, my name, my future. You took everything, all in the name of your precious abstract law." He leaned forward, the lantern light carving sharp, predatory angles on his face. "Justice, Marshal, is merely a story the powerful tell the weak to keep them in line. I prefer to write my own stories. And in my story, the villain doesn't walk away unscathed." The saloon doors creaked open. and Sheriff Miller stepped inside, shaking sand from his hat. "Blackwood, this has gone far enough," he said, his voice attempting a strength it didn't possess. Two of Blackwood's men immediately trained their rifles on him. "Sheriff, your timing is impeccable," Blackwood said with a sneer. "You're just in time for the final act. You've played your part so well, feeding Mr. Coulter just enough information to lead him here. A masterful performance." Miller's face was pale, his eyes darting between Blackwood and Jack. He looked like a man caught between a rock and a hard place, and Jack felt a flash of pity mixed with his contempt. "It started in Silver Falls, didn't it?" Jack said, his focus locked on Blackwood. "Your father, your sister Annabelle." The name struck Blackwood like a physical blow. The mask of calm superiority cracked, revealing the raw, grieving man beneath. "Do not speak her name," he hissed, his voice trembling with a sudden violent rage. "You have no right." He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver locket. He didn't throw it on the table. He placed it there gently, as if it were a sacred relic. This was hers, Blackwood said, his voice now quiet, freighted with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. She wore it every day. It was the last piece of beauty left in her world after you destroyed it. He opened the locket. Inside, protected by a tiny pane of glass, was a miniature hand-painted portrait. It was a young woman with dark hair and eyes filled with a sad, gentle light. Silas's sister. "Your justice drove my father to take his own life." Silas continued, his voice regaining its venomous edge. "It killed my mother with grief, and it sent my sister, my sweet Annabelle, to walk to the edge of a cliff because she could no longer bear the weight of the world you had created for us. You didn't just enforce the law, Coulter. You were a plague that wiped my family from the earth." The tension in the room was a physical thing, a coiled spring wound so tight it was about to shatter. The howling of the storm outside was a fitting soundtrack to the maelstrom of grief and vengeance inside. "Your father was a criminal who stole from hundreds of families," Jack said, his own voice low and steady. "And your sister's death was a tragedy. But it was not my doing." "Wasn't it?" Blackwood countered, rising slowly from his chair. "You are the cause, the root of it all. And now you will be the resolution." It was then that the unexpected happened. Sheriff Miller, who had been standing frozen near the door, slowly drew his revolver. But he didn't point it at Jack. He pointed it squarely at the back of one of Blackwood's men. "It's over," Silas Miller said, his voice shaking but firm. Blackwood stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. You were working for me." "No," Miller said, a grim resolve hardening his features. "I was working for my town. I fed you what Coulter wanted you to know. I led you into this room. I led you into his trap." The secondary twist was a perfect, stunning reversal. The corrupt sheriff was a double agent. The pawn had been a queen all along. Blackwood's face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. "Then you all die here." The world exploded into motion. Blackwood drew his pistol. His men turned their rifles. Miller fired. Jack drew his Colt with a speed that was pure instinct, a ghost of his former self made real. The saloon became a deafening cauldron of noise and smoke. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. One of Blackwood's men fell Miller's bullet in his back. Another went down as Jack fired twice the motions, economical and deadly. Jack dove behind the bar as bullets ripped through the space where he had been standing. He came up firing his focus entirely on Blackwood. Theirs was the only fight that mattered. They were two sides of the same coin, two men defined by loss at their duel, a brutal finality to a story that had begun 5 years ago. Blackwood was fast and accurate, but he was fueled by rage. Jack was fueled by something colder, something more enduring. He moved, fired, and reloaded with a mechanical precision honed over a lifetime. The gunfight was short, brutal, and absolute. When the smoke cleared, Miller was leaning against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his shirt, but he was alive. Blackwood's men were dead. And Silas Blackwood lay on the floor near the poker table, his life bleeding out onto the dusty floorboards. Jack walked over to him, his pistol still aimed. Blackwood looked up, his eyes glazed with pain and a dawning tragic understanding. Was it worth it? Jack asked the question, not an accusation, but a genuine inquiry. Blackwood coughed, a faint, bloody smile touching his lips. "She is at peace," he whispered. "Now, I will be." His eyes lost their focus, and the fire that had burned in him for 5 long years was finally extinguished. Jack stood over him for a long moment, the silence in the room now more profound than the fading storm outside. He bent down and picked up the silver locket. He looked at the portrait of Annabelle Blackwood, her gentle eyes staring up at him, a silent testament to the terrible tangled web of justice and vengeance. As the sandstorm abated its fury, spent a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the saloon's grimy windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. The town emerged slowly from its shelters, the people drawn by the sudden silence. They peered into the saloon and saw the aftermath of the storm within the storm. Blackwood's reign of terror was over. Dr. Finch, his arm in a sling and his face still bruised, pushed his way through the crowd to tend to Sheriff Miller's wound. "It's clean through the shoulder," Finch announced with clinical detachment. "You'll live, you old fool." Miller managed a weak grin. "Had to make it look convincing," he said to Jack. Blackwood was too smart. If he'd suspected for a second I wasn't truly in his pocket, he'd have killed me and found another way. I had to play the long game, feed him information you wanted him to have, lure him into a place where you could face him on your terms. Elias Vance ran in his face, frantic. "My pa." "He's safe," Miller said, wincing as Finch tightened a bandage. "Blackwood sent a man to release him the moment you walked into this saloon. He's back at your homestead, shaken but unharmed." Relief washed over the young man's face, followed by a quiet, profound gratitude as he looked at Jack. Jack said nothing. He stood by the window, turning the silver locket over and over in his hand. He finally understood the full tragic scope of the story. He had been the instrument of the law, and his actions had created a ripple of devastation he had never intended. Silas Blackwood had been a monster, but he was a monster born of grief, a man twisted into something unrecognizable by a loss he could not bear. In a different world, under different circumstances, perhaps they would not have been enemies. He opened the locket again and stared at the face of Annabelle Blackwood. Her death had been the catalyst for so much pain, a single tragedy that had blossomed into a war. He felt a deep, weary sorrow, not just for Eleanor, but for Silas, for Annabelle, for all the lives consumed by this long-burning fire of revenge. The clean, hard line between right and wrong had blurred into an indistinguishable gray. He walked out of the saloon, leaving the townspeople to their relief and the sheriff to the doctor's care. He needed air. He needed silence. The world felt raw and new, scrubbed clean by the storm. He had won. He had survived. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending, a final closing of a book he had been forced to read to its last bloody page. Months passed. The town of Redemption Creek, freed from the shadow of Silas Blackwood, began to heal. The dam on the creek was dismantled, and water flowed freely to the valley's ranches again. With the deeds and claims Jack had recovered, families like the Vances were able to reclaim their land. A new sense of community forged in the shared threat, and its violent resolution took root. The town was living up to its name not through divine intervention, but through the hard-won efforts of its people. Jack remained on the edge of it all, an observer more than a participant. He had helped Miller appoint a new capable deputy. He had given his testimony to the territorial judge. He had done his part. The townsfolk treated him with a quiet, respectful deference. But they kept their distance, sensing he was a man who still walked in the company of ghosts. One crisp autumn morning, he packed his few belongings into his saddlebags. His work here was done. Dr. Finch, his shoulder healed, came to see him off, as did Elias and Sheriff Miller. "You're leaving then," Miller said. It wasn't a question. "Reckon so," Jack replied. "Where will you go?" Elias asked, the hero-worship plain in his eyes. Jack looked west toward the jagged peaks of the distant mountains. "Don't know yet. Just away. The world is better off without men like Blackwood," Dr. Finch offered in his own gruff way of saying thank you. "But it still has need of men like you, Coulter. Don't stay a stranger to it for too long." Jack nodded, mounted his horse, and rode out of Redemption Creek without a backward glance. But he didn't ride west. He rode north toward the high country, toward a small windswept cemetery outside a town named Silver Falls. He found Eleanor's grave easily. The simple wooden cross he had carved for her was weathered but strong. He dismounted and stood before it, the cool mountain air sharp in his lungs. For 5 years this place had been a shrine to his grief, a symbol of his failure. Now it felt different, quieter. He took out the silver locket, Annabelle's locket. He had held on to it, feeling it was his responsibility, a final piece of the puzzle he had to put in its place. He looked at Eleanor's grave, and then at the vast, lonely expanse of the mountains around them. This was not where the locket belonged. He had another stop to make. He found the place the old newspaper article had described, a treacherous cliff overlooking the river gorge. There was no marker, no sign that a young woman's life had ended here. He stood at the edge, the wind tugging at his coat, and he thought of Annabelle Blackwood, a victim of circumstances far beyond her control. He opened the locket one last time, looking at the sad, gentle eyes in the portrait. Then, with a quiet prayer for a soul he had never known, he tossed the locket into the gorge. It caught the sunlight, a final fleeting flash of silver, before disappearing into the churning water below. It was a burial of sorts, a final laying to rest of the ghosts of Silver Falls. He returned to Eleanor's grave as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. He knelt and placed his hand on the earth. He had no locket to leave her, no token. All he had was himself, changed and scarred, but no longer hollow. He had faced his past not by running from it, but by riding directly into its heart. He had made a kind of peace with the man he had been and the choices he had made. He stayed until the first stars appeared in the deep purple sky. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and mounted his horse. His grief for Eleanor was still there, a part of him, an ache that would likely never fade completely. But it was no longer an anchor holding him in place. It was just a memory, a sad, beautiful story of a life he had loved and lost. He turned his horse not away from civilization, but toward the faint light of the rising sun in the east. He was no longer running from his past. He was riding toward a future he had earned.